Hello, and welcome. Find a place where you can be still. Let the noise and the glare of the modern world, with its relentless pace and its fleeting concerns, begin to fade away, like a distant landscape dissolving into a soft, evening mist. Tonight, we are undertaking a special kind of journey. We are parting the heavy, rustling, velvet curtains of history. We are stepping behind the closed, and often gilded, doors of the royal palace. We are entering the private chambers, the secret corridors, the intimate spaces where the fate of nations was so often decided, not by grand treaties or by heroic battles, but by the secret, the powerful, and the often scandalous desires of the human heart. We are here to explore the most shocking, the most consequential, and the most human of royal scandals. Our long journey begins not with a single, explosive story of a secret discovered, but with the exploration of an ancient, a powerful, and a deeply misunderstood institution, an institution that was, for centuries, a central and an accepted feature of many of the great royal courts of Europe. It is the institution of the royal mistress. In a world where royal marriages were, first and foremost, cold, strategic, and often loveless political alliances, marriages that were designed to unite kingdoms, to seal treaties, and to produce legitimate heirs, the king, the monarch, often sought the comforts of love, of genuine companionship, of intellectual partnership, and of simple human passion elsewhere. The royal mistress was not merely a secret, a hidden, and a shameful lover. In many courts, particularly in the sophisticated and the highly formalized court of France, she was a recognized, a formal, and an immensely powerful public figure. She was the shadow queen, a woman who, without a drop of royal blood in her veins, could come to shape the destiny of a nation from the intimate and the powerful space of the royal bedchamber. To understand this strange and fascinating world, let us travel to its most perfect, its most glittering, and its most deeply dangerous embodiment. Let us travel to the royal court of France in the middle of the 18th century. Let us enter the vast, the magnificent, and the almost overwhelmingly opulent palace of Versailles. This is the great, sun-drenched stage upon which the drama of the French absolute monarchy is played out, and the king, the sun, at the center of this glittering solar system, is Louis XV. Louis XV is a complex, a handsome, and a deeply melancholic man. He is the great-grandson of the Sun King, Louis XIV, the man who had built Versailles and who had perfected the art of absolute monarchy. But Louis XV does not possess his great-grandfather's iron will, his relentless work ethic, or his profound and unshakable sense of his own divine majesty. Louis XV is a man who is often crippled by a deep, a constitutional boredom, a kind of existential ennui. He is intelligent, he is charming, but he is also shy, he is indolent, and he is easily manipulated by those who can capture his attention and his affection. He is a king who is often more interested in hunting, in botany, and in the private pleasures of life than in the dull and the demanding business of governing his kingdom. The king is married, as all kings must be, to a royal princess. His wife is the quiet, the pious, and the deeply long-suffering Polish princess, Maria Leszczyńska. Theirs was a political match. She has performed her sacred duty. She has given the king 10 children, including a son, a male heir, the daughter. But she is a simple, a devout, and an unassuming woman. She cannot hold the interest of her restless and sophisticated husband. Their physical relationship has long since ended. She has retreated into a quiet, a private world of religious devotion and of maternal duty. The king is, to all intents and purposes, emotionally and sexually, a bachelor. And so, the court of Versailles is a place of intense, of constant, and of often ruthless competition among the beautiful, the ambitious, and the aristocratic women of the court, all of whom are vying for the single, the most powerful, and the most coveted prize in the kingdom, the position of the king's official mistress, the matron. Into this glittering, this decadent, and this deeply dangerous world, a world of ancient, noble families, and of intricate, unwritten rules, came a woman who was not born to it, a woman who would not only conquer this world, but who would come to define it. Her name was Jean Antoinette Poisson. She was not a duchess, she was not a princess. She was a woman of the rising bourgeois class, the daughter of a financier, a man who had been forced to flee the country due to a scandal in his own financial affairs. She was, in the cruel and the snobbish eyes of the old aristocratic court, a commoner, but she was a commoner of the most extraordinary and the most remarkable kind. She was, by all accounts, exceptionally beautiful, but her beauty was more than just physical perfection. It was animated by a brilliant, a quick, and a sparkling intelligence. She was a gifted singer, a talented actress, a skilled musician, a brilliant conversationalist, and she was possessed of a fierce, an unyielding, and a deeply strategic ambition. Her mother, a clever and a determined woman, had, from a very young age, groomed her daughter for a great destiny. A fortune-teller, it was said, had once predicted that the young Jean Antoinette would one day capture the heart of the king. And from that day on, her entire education, her entire life, was a preparation for this single, seemingly impossible, goal. She was married, at a young age, to a wealthy tax collector, a man named Charles Guillaume Le Normand d'Etiolles. This marriage gave her the wealth and the social standing she needed to host a fashionable salon in Paris, a gathering place for the great artists, the writers, and the philosophers of the Enlightenment, men like Voltaire and Diderot. She became known as one of the most charming, one of the most intelligent, and one of the most beautiful women in all of Paris. And she began, with a careful and a deliberate strategy, to place herself in the path of the king. She would appear at the royal hunts, dressed in a magnificent and eye-catching riding costume. She would attend the great masked balls at Versailles, her identity hidden, her charm and her wit on full display. And in the year 1745, at one of these great masked balls, the king, who was then in a state of deep mourning and of melancholy after the death of his previous mistress, finally and decisively noticed her. He was captivated, he was enchanted, he was, in a word, obsessed. Soon, her long-suffering husband was conveniently and officially separated from her, and the king installed her in an apartment at the Palace of Versailles, directly above his own. He gave her a title. She was now the Marquise de Pompadour, and for the next nearly 20 years, from 1745 until her death in 1764, she was the king's official, his acknowledged, and his immensely powerful mistress, the mate. She was far, far more than just a lover. She was the king's closest and most trusted friend. She was his most intimate confidant. She was his chief political advisor. She was, in all but name, the Queen of France. She understood, with a brilliant and an intuitive genius, the true nature of her role. Her primary function was to combat the king's profound, and often crippling, constitutional boredom. She was his chief entertainer, his event planner, his source of novelty and of delight. She organized magnificent and incredibly expensive private theatrical productions at the palace, in which she herself would often star. She commissioned plays, she commissioned operas. She was a major and a deeply influential patron of the arts. She championed the new, the lighter, and the more intimate style of Rococo painting. She was the patron of the great painters of the age, of Boucher, of Fragonard. She was a driving force behind the establishment of the porcelain factory, which produced some of the most beautiful and the most valuable ceramics ever made. She was also a great and a powerful intellectual force. She was a champion of the new, the radical, and the often dangerous ideas of the French Enlightenment. She supported Voltaire. She was a key supporter of the great, and the deeply controversial, project of the great encyclopedia edited by Diderot and d'Alembert, a project that the church and the more conservative elements of the court were desperately trying to suppress. She understood that to keep the king's interest, she had to keep his mind engaged, as well as his heart, and she was a major political player. The ministers of the government soon learned that the fastest and the most effective way to get their ideas and their policies approved by the king was to first get the approval of Madame de Pompadour. She would discuss matters of state with the king in the quiet, the intimate, and the informal setting of her private apartments. She would read the dispatches from the ambassadors. She would advise him on appointments. She was instrumental in the great diplomatic revolution of 1756, the great reversal of alliances that saw France abandon its traditional ally, Prussia, and form a new and ultimately disastrous alliance with its ancient enemy, Austria, an alliance that would lead to the catastrophic 7 Years' War. Her influence on the foreign and the domestic policy of France was immense, and it was, in the eyes of many, deeply pernicious. But her position, for all its power and its glamour, was one of constant, of exhausting, and of perilous insecurity. The official queen, Maria Lecheska, and her pious and deeply conservative circle of friends despised her. The king's own children, the Dauphin and his sisters, saw her as a wicked, a sinful, and an immoral influence on their father, and they lost no opportunity to snub her and to intrigue against her. And the old, the proud, and the deeply snobbish established nobility of the court, who had, for centuries, believed that the position of royal mistress was their own, exclusive property, were deeply and profoundly scandalized by her bourgeois birth. They looked down on her with an undisguised and a vicious contempt. As a commoner, a grisette, a shopkeeper's daughter, who had bewitched the king, they nicknamed her the harlot, and they plotted, constantly and tirelessly, to bring about her downfall. Her life was a masterpiece of political, of social, and of psychological maneuvering. She had to be, at all times, a brilliant conversationalist, a charming hostess, a witty companion, a shrewd political strategist, an informed and an intelligent advisor, and she had to constantly and tirelessly manage the melancholic, the depressive, and the easily bored temperament of the king himself. After about 5 years, their direct, physical relationship faded. The king, a man of a voracious and a fickle sexual appetite, began to take other, younger, and less complicated lovers. A lesser woman, in this situation, would have been dismissed, would have been pensioned off, would have been sent into a quiet and a comfortable exile. But Madame de Pompadour, with a political and a psychological genius that was truly breathtaking, managed to transform her role. She transitioned, seamlessly, from being the king's mistress to being his best, his most essential, and his most irreplaceable friend. She maintained her position, her power, and her apartments at Versailles, and, it was widely, and probably accurately, believed, she even took on the role of a kind of unofficial procuress for the king. She would find, she would vet, and she would discreetly install a series of young, beautiful, and usually unintelligent and unambitious young women in a small, private house in the Park of Versailles, the Parc aux Cerfs, where the king could visit them in secret, satisfying his physical desires without creating a new and a powerful political rival for her own position. The story of Madame de Pompadour is the story of the royal scandal in its most powerful, its most sophisticated, and its most political form. It is the story of how personal affection, how sexual desire, how intelligence, and how an iron and an unyielding ambition could be transformed into immense and almost absolute political power. But it is also a story of the deep, the corrosive, and the profound hypocrisy of the old regime. It is a story of the savage, the relentless, and the almost unbearable intrigue of the court, and it is a story of the profound and the almost unimaginable loneliness of a life that is lived entirely in the bright, the unforgiving, and the gilded cage of royal favor. If the king's affair, in the glittering and cynical world of the French court, was a recognized, a public, and a political institution, then the queen's affair, in the deeply patriarchal, the dynastically obsessed, and the spiritually anxious world of Tudor England, was a matter of the most profound, the most dangerous, and the most terrifying significance. It was a matter of treason. The body of the king, in the political theology of the age, was his own, a vessel of God's anointed and absolute power. But the body of the queen, from the moment of her coronation, belonged to the state. Her womb was not a private space. It was the sacred, the dynastic, and the deeply political vessel that contained the future of the kingdom itself. Her most sacred, her most solemn, and her only truly essential duty was to produce a legitimate, a healthy, and a male heir. The entire stability, the peace, and the future of the kingdom rested on the frail, and often uncertain, shoulders of a newborn infant. And any suspicion, any rumor, any whisper, that this heir, this prince, might not be the king's own true-born son, was a direct and a mortal threat to the very stability and the very survival of the kingdom. A queen's adultery, therefore, was not just a personal betrayal of her husband. It was a potential act of high treason, a crime that polluted the royal bloodline and that threatened to plunge the entire realm into the chaos and the bloodshed of a disputed succession. And it was a crime that was, in this brutal and unforgiving age, often punished with a swift, a spectacular, and a public finality. To understand this high-stakes and deeply dangerous world, let us journey back in time, to the brilliant, the brutal, and the deeply paranoid court of the great Tudor king, Henry VIII. We are in the year 1536. The king is married to his second wife, the brilliant, the charismatic, the ambitious, and the fiery Anne Boleyn. Let us recall the great, the world-shattering drama that had brought her to the throne. For years, King Henry had been engaged in a desperate, an obsessive, and a deeply theological struggle to end his first marriage, his long, and in his eyes, his cursed union with the pious and the noble Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. He had defied the Pope. He had broken, with a shocking and an unprecedented finality, the 1,000-year-old bond that had tied his kingdom to the universal Catholic Church. He had declared himself, in an act of supreme and almost unbelievable arrogance, the supreme head of the Church of England on earth. And he had done all of this. He had unleashed this profound and this violent religious revolution for one primary and deeply personal reason. He had done it to annul his first marriage and to be free to marry Anne Boleyn. He had done it in the desperate, the all-consuming, and the almost hysterical hope that she, and she alone, could give him the one thing he craved above all others: a son, a male heir, a Duke of York, to secure the future of his new and still fragile Tudor dynasty. Anne, for her part, had been more than just a beautiful woman who had caught the king's eye. She was a woman of immense intelligence, of great political skill, of a sharp and a witty tongue, and of a powerful and a deeply reformist religious conviction. For 7 long years, she had played a brilliant, a patient, and a deeply dangerous game. She had held the king at bay. She had refused to become his mistress. She had insisted on becoming his wife, his queen, and she had, with a confidence that in retrospect seems almost tragic, promised him that she, unlike the aging and the supposedly barren Catherine, could and would give him the son and the heir that he so desperately craved. And in the year 1533, after the great break with Rome was complete, she had finally and triumphantly married him. She was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent and a hugely expensive ceremony at Westminster Abbey, and she was pregnant. The entire kingdom held its breath. The astrologers consulted the stars. The king planned a great and a magnificent tournament to celebrate the birth of his long-awaited son. But in September of that year, in the royal palace at Greenwich, Anne gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter, a healthy, a red-haired, and an intelligent daughter, the future and the great Queen Elizabeth I. But for Henry, in that moment, it was a bitter, a crushing, and a deeply personal disappointment. He had defied the Pope. He had risked his immortal soul. He had torn his kingdom apart, and his reward was another daughter. Anne's position, from that moment on, was a deeply precarious one. Her entire power, her entire influence, her very survival, depended on her ability to produce a male heir. A subsequent pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage, and now, in the early months of 1536, another, a final, and a catastrophic pregnancy had ended with the birth of a stillborn son, and the king's passionate, and once all-consuming, love for her had begun to curdle into a cold, a paranoid, and a deadly impatience. He began to believe that this marriage, too, was cursed by God. He began to believe that Anne, with her sharp intelligence, her fiery temper, and her often arrogant and dismissive treatment of the old, established nobility, was a witch, a sorceress who had bewitched him with her dark and her unnatural powers, and his eye, his famously fickle and ever-roving eye, had already fallen upon a new, quieter, a gentler, and a seemingly more submissive and more fertile lady-in-waiting at the court. Her name was Jane Seymour. The king needed to get rid of Anne Boleyn, but another divorce, another great public and embarrassing annulment, after the immense political and the profound religious upheaval of his first one, was a difficult, an unseemly, and a deeply unpalatable prospect. A different, a more permanent, a more brutal, and a more decisive solution was required. Into this tense, this paranoid, and this deeply dangerous atmosphere stepped the king's chief minister, a man named Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was a brilliant, a ruthless, a pragmatic, and a completely unsentimental political operator, a man who had risen from the humble origins of a blacksmith's son to become the most powerful man in the kingdom, after the king himself. Cromwell had been an ally of Anne Boleyn in the great struggle for the break with Rome, but now he saw that Anne's power was fading, that she was becoming a liability to the king, and that the king wanted her gone, and Cromwell, the ultimate political survivor, knew what he had to do. Suddenly, in the spring of 1536, a series of shocking, of bizarre, and of almost unbelievable accusations were brought against the queen. She was accused of adultery. She was accused of having had a series of sordid and treasonous affairs with a number of men from her own close courtly circle. These men included a young and a handsome court musician named Mark Smeaton. They included several of the king's own closest friends and gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, men like Sir Henry Norris and Sir Francis Weston, and even more shockingly, even more terribly, she was accused of the ultimate, the most depraved, and the most unnatural of all sins. She was accused of incest. She was accused of having had a long-standing and a deeply sexual relationship with her own beloved and brilliant brother, George Bullen, Lord Rochford, and finally, to give these private, sexual crimes the necessary weight of public political treason, she was accused of having conspired with her brother and her other lovers to bring about the death of the king himself, so that she could marry one of her lovers after he was gone. The charges were almost certainly a complete, a cynical, and a politically motivated fabrication. They were a legal fiction, a carefully constructed and a deeply evil story that was likely concocted by the brilliant and the ruthless mind of Thomas Cromwell to give the king the legal and the moral justification he needed to destroy his unwanted wife. The evidence for these terrible crimes was flimsy to non-existent. It was based on a few vague and overheard comments of courtly flirtation, which were then twisted and distorted into evidence of a great, treasonous conspiracy, and it was based on a series of coerced confessions which were almost certainly extracted from the low-born musician, Mark Smeaton at least, under the most brutal and the most agonizing of illegal torture. But it was enough. In the terrified, the paranoid, and the deeply subservient atmosphere of Henry VIII's court, it was more than enough. A special court was convened to try the Queen and the accused men. The trial was a show trial, a piece of brutal political theatre. Its outcome was a foregone conclusion. Anne and her brother, George, were tried by a jury of their peers, a jury that was packed with their political enemies, the old, conservative nobility, who had always hated the upstart Boleyns. Anne defended herself with a calm, a dignified, and a brilliant intelligence, but it was useless. She, and her brother, and the other 4 men, were all found guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. The men were executed first, in a public, a brutal, and a deeply humiliating fashion. George Bullen and the other 4 gentlemen were beheaded on Tower Hill. The musician, Mark Smeaton, was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most terrible and the most degrading of all English executions. But for Anne, his queen, the king, in a final, a bizarre, and a chillingly theatrical act of what he, perhaps, in his own mind, saw as a form of mercy, granted her a more noble, a more modern, and a more dignified form of execution. He spared her the clumsy, and often brutal, blow of the heavy English executioner's axe. He sent, at his own expense, to the English-held territory of Calais, in France, for a special and a highly skilled swordsman, an expert in the more elegant, and supposedly more humane, French style of execution by the sword. On the morning of the 19th of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn, who had been the proud and the powerful Queen of England for only 3 short and tumultuous years, was led to a private scaffold that had been specially erected within the secure and the silent walls of the Tower of London. She was dressed not in the sombre black of a condemned traitor, but in a dark grey damask gown trimmed with ermine fur, a quiet and a final assertion of her royal status. She addressed the small, the select crowd of assembled notables with a quiet, a calm, and a truly remarkable dignity and composure. She did not confess to the crimes for which she was about to die, but she did not protest her innocence either, for that would have been to question the king's justice, and that would have been a final and a futile act of treason. She simply, and with a great and a moving piety, asked for the prayers of the people, and she prayed for the long and the prosperous life of the king. And then she knelt. She removed her ermine cloak. Her ladies-in-waiting, their faces streaming with tears, tied a blindfold over her eyes. The French swordsman, a man of great experience and of professional pride, is said to have distracted her, to have called for his sword, and then, as she turned her head, to have, with a single, a swift, a silent, and a devastatingly expert stroke, severed her head from her body. The very next day, King Henry VIII was formally betrothed to the quiet, the gentle, and the demure Jane Seymour. The story of the fall of Anne Boleyn is a stark, a brutal, and a terrifying reminder of the absolute, the precarious, and the deadly vulnerability of a medieval queen. Her life, her power, her very survival, was entirely and completely dependent on 2 fragile, on two unpredictable and on two interconnected things: her biological ability to produce a healthy male heir, and the passionate, and the often fickle and unpredictable affection of her royal husband. When both of those things were lost, she was left with nothing. She was left exposed, she was left vulnerable, and she was left, in the end, to the cold, the cynical, and the ruthless machinations of a political world that had no more use for her. Her body, which had once been the sacred and the celebrated vessel of the king's hope and of the future of the Tudor dynasty, became, in the end, the object of his fatal and his politically convenient wrath. The production of a legitimate, a healthy, and a verifiably male heir was the single, the most important, and the most solemn duty of any royal marriage in the age of monarchy. The entire, the vast, and the often fragile edifice of the state, its peace, its stability, its very future, rested on the frail, and the often uncertain, shoulders of a single, newborn infant. A secure, and unquestioned, and a legitimate succession was the greatest guarantee of a kingdom's stability. A disputed, an uncertain, or a suspicious succession was a direct and an open invitation to chaos, to factionalism, to treason, and to the horrors of a bloody and a destructive civil war. It is no surprise, then, that one of the most persistent, the most dangerous, the most potent, and the most difficult to disprove of all the various forms of royal scandals was the dark, the insidious, and the deeply destabilizing rumor of the changeling. It was the whispered, the treasonous suggestion that the royal baby, the precious and the long-awaited heir to the throne, was not the Queen's own true-born child at all, but was, in fact, a substitute, a commoner's baby, of the correct and the convenient sex that had been secretly and conspiratorially smuggled into the royal birthing chamber to hide the terrible and the dynastically catastrophic fact that the Queen had given birth to a daughter, or, even worse, to a stillborn child. To understand the power and the plausibility of such a rumor, let us travel to the court of late Stuart England, to the year 1688. The kingdom is in a state of profound, of deep, and of almost unbearable religious and political tension. The king, James II, is an intelligent, a stubborn, and a deeply and an unapologetically devout Roman Catholic, ruling over a fiercely, a proudly, and a predominantly Protestant nation. His faith, in the eyes of many of his subjects, was a deep and a fundamental betrayal of his sacred duty to protect the Protestant Church of England, of which he was the supreme governor. His first marriage, to the Protestant Anne Hyde, had produced two healthy and equally Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. Mary, the eldest, was married to the great Protestant champion of Europe, the formidable and the respected Dutch prince, William of Orange. As long as James had no son, the nation could live with its Catholic king, secure in the knowledge that upon his death, the crown would pass to his Protestant daughter, Mary, and the Protestant succession would be safe. But the king's second wife, the beautiful, the young, the Italian, and the deeply and fervently Catholic Mary of Modena, after many long and frustrating years of a childless marriage, of miscarriages, and of infant deaths, had in the late months of 1687, suddenly, and, too many, suspiciously, become pregnant. The news of the Queen's pregnancy was not met with universal joy, for the Protestant establishment of England, for the great Whig lords, for the bishops of the Church of England, for the common people of London with their deep and almost hysterical fear of popery. This pregnancy was a disaster. It was a catastrophe in the making. If the Queen gave birth to a healthy son, that son would, by the ancient and the unbending laws of male primogeniture, immediately and automatically displace his older, his Protestant, and his half-sisters, Mary and Anne, in the line of succession. This son would, without a doubt, be raised as a devout Roman Catholic, and he would, upon his father's death, inherit the throne, thus ensuring the continuation and the permanent establishment of a Catholic dynasty on the throne of Protestant England. This was, for many of the most powerful and the most influential people in the kingdom, an unthinkable, an intolerable, and a terrifying prospect. It was a prospect that had to be avoided at any and at all costs. And so, as the Queen's pregnancy progressed, a dark, a vicious, a sophisticated, and a highly effective whispering campaign began. It was a brilliant and a deeply cynical piece of political propaganda, a campaign that was designed to preemptively delegitimize the unborn child. It was rumored, in the coffee houses, in the political clubs, in the pamphlets that were secretly printed and distributed in the back alleys of London, that the Queen was not really pregnant at all, that her swollen belly was a fake, that her entire pregnancy was a pious fraud, a great and a Jesuitical Catholic plot to steal the throne of England. It was whispered, with a knowing and a salacious wink, that the Jesuits, the Queen's Italian attendants, and the King's Catholic priests were engaged in a dark and a treasonous conspiracy. They were planning, it was said, to smuggle a newborn baby boy, the child of some poor, anonymous commoner, into the royal birthing chamber at the very moment of the supposed delivery, and they would then present this changeling, this fraudulent substitute, to the world as the new, the legitimate, and the Catholic Prince of Wales. The birth of a royal child, in this period, was not a private, a medical, and a secluded event. It was a profoundly, and a necessarily, public and political one. To guard against just such a substitution, to ensure the absolute and the undeniable legitimacy of the heir to the throne, it was the long-standing and the unbreakable custom that a great number of high-ranking and official witnesses be physically present in the royal birthing chamber itself. They were there to witness the delivery, to see the child the moment it was born, and to publicly and formally certify the legitimacy of the royal infant. These witnesses would always include the great officers of state, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord President of the Council, the Lord Privy Seal. It would include the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England. It would include the foreign ambassadors, and it would include the members of the royal family themselves. But in June of the year 1688, when Queen Mary of Modena went into labour at St. James's Palace, a series of unfortunate, of suspicious, and of politically catastrophic accidents occurred. The birth happened suddenly, and somewhat prematurely, and many of the key, the most important, and most crucially, the most powerful and the most credible Protestant witnesses were not summoned in time, or were, for various reasons, not present. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important spiritual witness in the kingdom, was not there. The Princess Anne, the King's own Protestant daughter, and the person with the most to lose from the birth of a brother, was not there. She had, conveniently, gone to the spa town of Bath for her health. The Dutch ambassador, the official representative of the King's Protestant son-in-law and nephew, William of Orange, was not there. The only people who were present in the crowded, the hot, and the chaotic birthing chamber were the King himself, the Queen, her doctors and her midwives, and a small, a select, and a carefully chosen group of the Queen's own, mostly Italian and exclusively Catholic, attendants and ladies-in-waiting. The audience was, in the eyes of the suspicious Protestant nation, a partisan one. And so, when it was announced, on the 10th of June, that the Queen had, indeed, and against all expectations, given birth to a healthy, a strong, and a living son, the rumors exploded into a full-blown national crisis. The whispers became a great, a deafening, and a national roar of disbelief and of accusation. The story of the warming pan baby was born. It was claimed, in 1,000 pamphlets and in 1,000 sermons, that the real royal baby had been stillborn, and that a healthy, living commoner's child had been secretly and cunningly smuggled into the royal birthing chamber, hidden inside a long-handled and lidded brass warming pan, the kind of pan that was used to warm the cold sheets of the royal bed with hot coals. The warming pan baby became a powerful, a simple, a memorable, and a deeply damaging symbol of a perceived Catholic conspiracy. It was a story that was, in its very nature, almost impossible to disprove. How could the King prove, with absolute and undeniable certainty, that something had not been smuggled into the room? King James, in a desperate and an almost pathetic attempt to quell the rising tide of rumor and of sedition, took the unprecedented and deeply undignified step of convening a special, an extraordinary session of his Privy Council. He brought dozens of witnesses, over 40 of them, from the great ladies of the court to the Queen's humble laundress and her doctors, to give sworn, and often graphically, almost pornographically detailed, testimony about the intimate, physical reality of the Queen's pregnancy and of the details of the birth. They testified, under oath, about the Queen's morning sickness, about the swelling of her breasts, about the physical state of the royal bedsheets and the Queen's linen after the delivery. The entire and highly embarrassing transcript of this testimony was then published by the King and was distributed in a pamphlet throughout the kingdom. But it was far, far too late. The propaganda had done its work. The people believed what they were predisposed to believe, what they wanted to believe. The legitimacy of the new Prince of Wales, the infant James Francis Edward Stuart, was permanently and fatally compromised in the eyes of the vast majority of his future Protestant subjects. This scandal, this crisis of legitimacy, was the final, the powerful spark that ignited the Glorious Revolution. A group of 7 powerful Protestant nobles, the Immortal Seven, sent a secret, a treasonous invitation to the king's Protestant son-in-law, William of Orange, asking him to invade England with an army, to save the country from a Catholic tyranny, and to secure the Protestant succession. William landed with his great army at Torbay in November of 1688. King James, his own army deserting him, his own daughter, the Princess Anne, abandoning him, his support throughout the kingdom completely collapsing, was forced to flee, in humiliation and in terror, to France. And the infant Prince of Wales, the poor, innocent warming-pan baby, the child whose very birth had triggered the downfall of his father's dynasty, was taken with him. He would grow up in exile at the French court. He would become the focus of the lost, the romantic, and the ultimately doomed Jacobite cause for the next half-century. The man who was known to his enemies as the Old Pretender. The third unspoken rule of royal life, a rule that was so brutally and so effectively demonstrated in this great and consequential scandal, is that the Queen's body is a public space. Her pregnancy, her delivery, are not private, medical events. They are matters of state. They are political theater, and they must be witnessed. They must be certified. They must be scrutinized by the right people. For in a world where the royal bloodline is everything, the slightest doubt, the faintest and most unsubstantiated whisper of a scandal surrounding the legitimacy of an heir can be enough to bring down a dynasty, to topple a king, and to change the course of a nation's history forever. Scandal, in the royal world, was not always a matter of secret, of illicit liaisons conducted in the shadowy corridors of the palace, or of whispered, of unsubstantiated, and of poisonous rumors about the legitimacy of a newborn child. Sometimes, the scandal was a public, a formal, a deliberate, and a world-shattering event. It was a conscious and a revolutionary act, undertaken by the monarch himself, an act that would tear apart the very fabric of society, that would challenge the authority of God on earth, and that would change the course of history forever. And perhaps no royal scandal was more consequential, more transformative, and more deeply, almost obsessively, personal than the great and the all-consuming quest of King Henry VIII of England to divorce his first, his loyal, and his deeply pious wife, Catherine of Aragon. This was the issue that dominated the politics, the religion, and the very consciousness of England for almost a decade. It was known, with a kind of grim and understated majesty, as the king's great matter, and its pursuit would lead not just to a personal and to a dynastic crisis, but to a profound, a violent, a permanent, and a deeply consequential religious revolution. Let us travel back in time to the brilliant, the brutal, the cultured, and the deeply paranoid court of Tudor England. In the 1520s, the king, Henry VIII, is on the throne. He is no longer the slender, the athletic, and the golden youth who had inherited the kingdom in 1509. He is now a man in his mid-30s, beginning to thicken at the waist, a man of immense and of formidable intelligence, of powerful and of often terrifying passions, and of a deep, a sincere, and a profoundly egocentric piety. He is married to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. She is the daughter of the two great and almost mythical Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the very rulers who had completed the reconquista of Spain from the Moors, and who had sponsored the voyages of Christopher Columbus. Their marriage, which had taken place shortly after Henry's accession to the throne, was a great, a prestigious, and a deeply significant diplomatic alliance. It was designed to cement the peace and the friendship between the rising, but still somewhat peripheral, Kingdom of England and the new, the vast, and the immensely wealthy superpower of Spain. And for many, many years, the marriage was a successful, a stable, and a seemingly happy one. Henry and Catherine were, by all accounts, genuinely fond of each other. He admired her piety, her intelligence, her queenly dignity. She adored him, her handsome, her chivalrous, and her brilliant young husband. The Queen was deeply popular with the English people, who respected her for her devout and her charitable nature. But the marriage, this union of two great royal houses, had one great, one tragic, and in the eyes of the increasingly anxious king, one fatal and one unforgivable flaw. It had failed, after nearly 2 decades, to produce a healthy and a surviving male heir. The production of a son was the single, the most important, and the most solemn duty of any queen. And in this duty, Catherine, through no fault of her own, had failed. Over the course of their long marriage, Queen Catherine had endured a series of heartbreaking and physically grueling pregnancies. She had suffered multiple, devastating miscarriages. She had suffered stillbirths. She had given birth to several infant sons, little princes who had lived for only a few precious and hope-filled weeks before dying. Only one of all her many children had survived the perilous gauntlet of infancy and of childhood. This was a healthy, an intelligent, and a beloved daughter, the Princess Mary. For King Henry, a daughter was not enough. The Tudor dynasty, his own family, was a new one. It was a dynasty that was still haunted by the memory of its own violent birth. His father, Henry VII, had seized the throne by conquest at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending the long, the bloody, and the deeply traumatic civil wars that we now call the Wars of the Roses. The legitimacy of his family's rule was still fragile, was still, in the eyes of some of the old, great noble families, questionable. Henry believed, with an almost religious and a deeply superstitious conviction, that only a male heir could truly secure the Tudor dynasty. He feared, with a genuine and a powerful terror, that if he were to die leaving only a daughter to inherit the throne, the kingdom would inevitably and immediately slide back into the chaos, the bloodshed, and the anarchy of civil war, as the great, ambitious noble houses fought each other for the crown. The idea of a ruling queen was, in itself, a deeply problematic and an almost unnatural concept in the patriarchal world of the 16th century. And as he grew older, as he passed from his vigorous youth into a more anxious and a more introspective middle age, as his obsession with a son grew more desperate, Henry became utterly and unshakably convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God. He began, in the deep and the secret recesses of his own conscience, to look for a reason for this divine displeasure, and he found it, with the help of his learned theological advisors, in the pages of the Bible itself. He found it in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 20, verse 21, and the verse read, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." Catherine of Aragon had, before she had married Henry, been briefly and almost certainly unconsummatedly married to Henry's own, sickly older brother, Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who had died young. A special, and a very expensive, papal dispensation had been required from the Pope in Rome to allow Henry to marry his brother's widow, to preserve the precious Spanish alliance. Now, many years later, Henry, in his desperate and his self-serving search for an explanation for his lack of a son, became utterly and completely convinced that this papal dispensation had been invalid, that the Pope had had no right to dispense with a law that was so clearly and so unambiguously laid down in the Holy Scripture. He became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was, and had always been, in the eyes of a just and an angry God, a sinful, a polluted, and an incestuous union, and that his long and his tragic history of stillborn sons was not an accident of biology, but was God's direct, his terrible, and his just punishment for this great and ongoing sin. At the very same time that the king's conscience was undergoing this profound and this deeply convenient theological crisis, another, a more earthly, a more passionate, and a far more powerful force entered the equation. The king fell deeply, passionately, and obsessively in love. The object of his affection was a young, a brilliant, a charismatic, and a fiercely and a dazzlingly ambitious lady-in-waiting at the court. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne was not a conventional beauty by the standards of her time, but she was a woman of immense and of captivating charm. She had spent her formative years at the sophisticated and the sexually liberated French court, and she had returned to England with a style, a wit, and a confidence that was completely intoxicating to the English king. She was a woman of great intelligence, of a sharp and often cutting tongue, of a powerful and a deeply and sincerely held reformist, Protestant-leaning religious conviction, and of an iron, an unbending, and an almost unbelievable will. Anne was not content to be the king's mistress, to follow her own sister, Mary Boleyn, into the royal bed. She was a woman of immense, of almost royal ambition, and she played a brilliant, a patient, a risky, and a deeply dangerous game. For 7 long and frustrating years, she held the king, the most powerful man in her world, at bay. She refused to sleep with him. She refused to become his passing fancy, and she insisted, with an unshakable and a truly remarkable determination, that she would be his wife, his queen, or she would be nothing to him at all. And she promised him, with a confidence that in retrospect seems almost tragic in its hubris, that she, with her youth, with her fertility, with her uncursed womb, could and would give him the one thing he craved above all others: a son, a male heir, a Duke of York, to secure the future of his dynasty. And so, the king's great matter began in earnest. Henry, now completely and utterly convinced of the theological and the moral righteousness of his cause, and utterly besotted with the captivating Anne Boleyn, formally petitioned the Pope in Rome, Pope Clement VII, to grant him an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. The argument was a technical, a theological one. He did not ask for a divorce in the modern sense. He asked for the Pope to declare that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the very beginning, that it had never, in the eyes of God and of the Church, been a true marriage at all. In normal circumstances, a Pope, who was a political as well as a spiritual leader, might have been willing to find a way to accommodate such a powerful, and until now, such a loyal and a famously devout king. But these were not normal circumstances. The year was 1527, and the Pope, Clement VII, was, at this very moment, a virtual and a deeply humiliated prisoner in the city of Rome. The city of Rome had just been brutally and comprehensively sacked by the mutinous and the unpaid armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in all of Europe, the great Emperor Charles V. And Charles V was the nephew of Queen Catherine of Aragon. Charles was a man of a deep, a dynastic pride, and of a sincere, if a politically convenient piety. He was not about to stand by and to allow his own beloved aunt to be cast aside, to be publicly humiliated as an incestuous adulteress, and to have her proud and her legitimate daughter, the Princess Mary, declared a bastard. He put immense, he put constant, and he put unyielding pressure on the Pope to refuse Henry's request. The Pope, a clever but a deeply indecisive man, was caught in an impossible and a deeply unenviable political trap. On the one side, he had the angry and the impatient English king, threatening schism. On the other, he had the vastly more powerful Holy Roman Emperor, whose armies were occupying the city of Rome itself. And so, Clement did what so many weak and embattled politicians do. He delayed, he prevaricated, he played for time, he set up commissions, he held out the false hope of a solution. He sent a papal legate, Cardinal Campeggio, to England to hold a show trial, but he never, ever, made a final decision. For years, the king's great matter, the great legal and theological case, dragged on, a source of immense bearable and of almost unbearable frustration and of anger for the increasingly tyrannical King Henry. And as the long years passed, Henry's position and the position of his advisors began to radicalize. He was surrounded by a new, a dynamic, and an influential group of men like his new chief minister, the brilliant and the ruthless Thomas Cromwell, and his new Archbishop of Canterbury, the scholarly and the reform-minded Thomas Cranmer. These were men who were secret, and often sincere, sympathizers with the new, the exciting, and the revolutionary Protestant ideas that were sweeping across Germany and Northern Europe, the ideas of Martin Luther. They began, at first subtly, and then with a growing and a revolutionary confidence, to whisper a new, a radical, and a deeply attractive idea into the king's ear. They argued, citing ancient historical and theological precedents, that the Pope in Rome had no real, no divine, and no legitimate authority over the Church in the sovereign kingdom of England. They argued that the King of England, as God's anointed sovereign, was, and in their reading of history, had always been, the rightful, the supreme, and the only head of the Church within his own kingdom. This was the brilliant, the simple, and the revolutionary solution that Henry had been so desperately looking for. If the Pope would not grant him his divorce, then he would simply, and unilaterally, declare that the Pope had no authority, no jurisdiction, to grant it in the first place. He would, in essence, break with Rome. He would become his own Pope. And so, in a series of dramatic, of breathtakingly bold, and of world-shattering parliamentary acts between the years 1532 and 1534, King Henry VIII, guided by the brilliant legal mind of Thomas Cromwell, step by step, dismantled the power of the Catholic Church in England. He cut off all the traditional and very lucrative payments of church taxes to Rome. He declared that all religious and legal appeals were to be finally settled in England, not in Rome. He declared that he, and not the Pope, now had the sole authority to appoint the bishops of his kingdom. And finally, and most momentously of all, with the great and the revolutionary Act of Supremacy of 1534, he declared himself, and all of his successors, to be the supreme head of the Church of England on earth. His new, and his compliant, Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, promptly convened a court. He declared that Henry's long and troubled marriage to Catherine of Aragon was, and always had been, null and void, and he declared that Henry's secret marriage to the now pregnant Anne Boleyn, which had taken place a few months earlier, was a good, a true, and a valid marriage. The king's great matter was, at long last, resolved. But the consequences of this deeply personal, and this deeply selfish decision were immense, were profound, were bloody, and were irreversible. Henry had, for a deeply personal, a dynastic, and a romantic reason, unleashed a religious revolution. The break with Rome led, in the years that followed, to the great and the brutal dissolution of the monasteries, the seizure of the vast and the ancient wealth of the Church by the Crown. It led to the creation of a new, a national, and an increasingly Protestant Church of England. And it led to a century and a half of profound, of bitter, and of often violent religious conflict, of persecutions, of rebellions, and of civil war. The fourth unspoken rule of royal life, a rule that was never more clearly and more devastatingly demonstrated, is that the personal desires, the conscience, the love life, and the dynastic anxieties of the monarch are never, ever truly personal. The king's conscience, the king's love for a woman, the king's desperate and obsessive need for a male heir were not private matters. They were matters of state. They were matters of theology. They were matters of national and of international destiny. And in the case of Henry VIII, his personal and his deeply selfish scandal, his great and his obsessive matter, was a force that was powerful enough to tear his entire kingdom away from its ancient, its thousand-year-old religious home, and to set it on a new, a different, a revolutionary, and a deeply and a permanently uncertain historical path. Not all royal scandals are great and world-shaking matters of state. They are not all about dynastic succession, about religious heresy, or about the toppling of kings. Some are smaller, are more personal, are more intimate, are, on the surface, more trivial. But in the highly charged, the deeply symbolic, the intensely scrutinized, and the almost theatrical world of the royal court, even a seemingly private matter of jewelry, of money, of ambition, and of deception can escalate into a massive, a public, and a deeply and a permanently damaging scandal. A scandal that can tarnish the sacred reputation of a monarch, that can fuel the fires of popular resentment and of hatred, and that can become a powerful, a simple, and an unforgettable symbol of a regime that is seen by its own people as decadent, as corrupt, as extravagant, and as hopelessly, and as criminally, out of touch with the realities of their lives. Such was the tragic, the bizarre, the almost unbelievable, and the deeply and the politically consequential story of the affair of the diamond necklace. Let us travel, once again, to the royal court of France, but to a later, a more glittering, a more refined, and a far more precarious time. We are in the 1780s. We are in the final, the sun-drenched, the beautiful, and the completely and the blissfully unsuspecting years of the ancien, the old, the aristocratic, and the divinely ordained order of France. The king is the gentle, the kind, the well-meaning, but the tragically weak, the deeply indecisive, and the almost pathologically shy Louis XVI, and his queen is the beautiful, the vivacious, the fashionable, and the deeply, and often profoundly and unfairly, unpopular Marie Antoinette. The queen, an Austrian princess by birth, a daughter of the great Empress Maria Theresa, had never been fully or warmly embraced by the French people or by the French court. From the moment of her arrival in France as a young, a naive, and a homesick girl, she was seen as a foreigner. She was, and would always be, in the cruel and the xenophobic slang of the Parisian streets, L'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. She was seen as frivolous, as extravagant, as a woman who spent a nation's fortune on magnificent and ever-changing dresses, on towering and often absurd hairstyles, on lavish parties, and on reckless high-stakes gambling at the card tables of Versailles. This reputation was, for the most part, a gross and an unfair exaggeration. But in a kingdom that was teetering on the very brink of bankruptcy, a kingdom where the ordinary people of Paris and of the countryside were suffering from high taxes, from unemployment, and from a chronic, a desperate, and a life-threatening shortage of bread, the perception of royal extravagance was a powerful and a dangerous political poison. The Queen was the subject of a constant, a vicious, a relentless, and a highly organized campaign of slander and of libel. This campaign took the form of cheap, of crudely printed, and of often shockingly naked pamphlets, the libels, which were sold, secretly and illegally, in the back alleys and the dark bookshops of Paris. These pamphlets, these weapons of a burgeoning and a revolutionary public opinion, depicted the Queen as a debauched, a decadent, a politically meddling, and a sexually insatiable monster. Her reputation, through no great fault of her own, was already deeply and perhaps irrevocably tarnished. Into this world of breathtaking glamour, of deep and of vicious political intrigue, and of a rising tide of public resentment, came a cast of characters that is worthy of a great, a tragic, and an almost comically absurd opera. First, there was the victim, the mark, the fool of the story. He was the Cardinal de Rohan, a high-ranking, an immensely wealthy, a powerful, and a deeply, almost comically, foolish and ambitious churchman. He was a prince of the church, and a member of one of the greatest and the most ancient noble families of France. He had once been the French ambassador to the Viennese court, the home of the Queen's mother, the formidable Empress Maria Theresa. But during his time there, he had, through a combination of his own arrogance and his dissolute lifestyle, managed to deeply and personally offend the powerful Empress. As a result of this, he was now deeply, and seemingly permanently, out of favor at the French court. Queen Marie Antoinette, who was devoted to the memory of her mother, could not stand him. She saw him as a dissolute, an immoral, and an untrustworthy man, and she refused, with a cold and a final finality, to speak to him, to even acknowledge his presence at court. For a man of the Cardinal de Rohan's immense pride, and of his even greater ambition, this was a living death. His greatest, his most desperate, and his all-consuming ambition was to win back the Queen's favor, to regain his position of influence and of power at the very center of the court. And then there was the villain of the piece, the brilliant, the charismatic, and the completely and utterly unscrupulous architect of the entire audacious plot. She was a woman who called herself the Comtesse de la Motte Valois. She was, in reality, a woman from a minor, an obscure, and an impoverished noble family, a distant and an illegitimate descendant of a former king of France. She was an adventuress, a conwoman of the highest order, a brilliant social climber, a master of deception, of manipulation, and of the art of exploiting the vanity and the greed of others. She had managed, through a combination of her charm, her wit, and her sheer, unmitigated nerve, to insinuate herself into the outer, the lower circles of the great court at Versailles, and she had become aware of the Cardinal de Rohan's desperate and his all-consuming ambition to win the Queen's favor, and in his weakness, in his desperation, she saw an opportunity, a great and a magnificent opportunity. She began, with a slow and a patient cunning, to cultivate a friendship with the Cardinal, and she began to hint, and then to state directly, that she was a secret, an intimate, and a deeply trusted confidant of the Queen herself. She began to act as a secret, and a completely fictitious intermediary between the desperate Cardinal and the Queen, who was, in reality, completely and totally unaware of this entire, and increasingly elaborate, plot. The Comtesse de la Motte would show the Cardinal letters. These were letters that were supposedly from the Queen, letters that were written, with a masterful and a convincing forgery of the Queen's own handwriting, on the correct, the expensive, and the distinctive, blue-gilded notepaper that was used at Versailles. These letters, at first cool, formal, and distant, gradually, over the course of many months, became warmer, more intimate, more forgiving. They suggested that the Queen, through the good and the kind offices of her dear friend, the Comtesse de la Motte, was beginning to soften her opinion of the Cardinal. The Cardinal, his heart filled with a new and a dizzying hope, was overjoyed. He was completely and utterly hooked. The great and audacious plot reached its theatrical and its almost farcical climax in the dark and the romantic gardens of the Palace of Versailles at night. The Comtesse de la Motte arranged a secret, a brief, a silent, and a deeply significant meeting between the cardinal and the queen. The woman who met the cardinal in a dark and a secluded grove of trees was not, of course, Marie Antoinette. It was a Parisian prostitute, a woman who bore a passing resemblance to the queen, a woman who had been hired and coached by the Comtesse for the occasion. In the deep and the deceptive darkness of the moonlit garden, the foolish and the love-struck cardinal was completely and utterly fooled. The false queen, her face hidden by the shadows and by a deep hood, handed him a single, perfect rose. She whispered a few indistinct words of forgiveness and of encouragement, and then, before he could say anything more, she quickly and mysteriously disappeared into the darkness. The cardinal was now completely, utterly, and blissfully convinced that he had won the queen's secret friendship, and perhaps even her heart. And now, the Comtesse de la Motte, having so perfectly and so completely prepared her victim, was ready to spring her great, her final, and her audacious trap. There was, at this time, in the possession of the official Parisian court jewelers, a man named Baumer and his partner Bassange, a magnificent, an incredible, an almost obscenely expensive, and a famously unsellable diamond necklace. It had been originally commissioned, many years before, by the old King Louis XV, for his famous and his extravagant mistress, Madame du Barry. But the old king had died before the necklace was completed, and before it was paid for. The necklace was a true and a breathtaking masterpiece of the jeweler's art. It was a vast, a complex, and a dazzling cascade of over 647 perfect and enormous diamonds, including several stones of a truly magnificent size and of a flawless purity. But its price was astronomical, a price that was almost beyond comprehension. It was valued at an estimated 2 million livres, a sum that was equivalent to the entire annual income of a great province of France. The jewelers, now on the verge of bankruptcy from the immense cost of this unsold masterpiece, had tried, on several occasions, to sell the necklace to the new queen, Marie Antoinette, but she, a woman who, for all her perceived frivolity, was keenly and painfully aware of the kingdom's precarious finances and of her own deeply negative public reputation for extravagance, had wisely, had consistently, and had firmly refused to buy it. The Comtesse de la Motte now saw her chance. She went to the Cardinal de Rohan, her completely and utterly deluded victim. She told him that the queen desperately, secretly, and passionately wanted to buy the necklace, but that she could not possibly do so publicly, for fear of the political backlash. She told him that the queen wanted him, the cardinal, her new and her most trusted secret friend, to act as her discreet, and her completely anonymous, intermediary in this delicate affair. She told him that if he would agree to act for her, to guarantee the payment for the necklace to the jewelers, it would be a final, an absolute, and an irrefutable proof of his devotion. It would be a service so great that it would win him the queen's eternal, and her public, gratitude. It would, she promised him, secure him the long-coveted and powerful position of the chief minister of France. The cardinal, his mind clouded by his immense and his almost pathological ambition, and by his foolish and his deeply pathetic vanity, completely and utterly fell for the great scam. He met with the desperate jewelers. He showed them the forged letters from the queen. He signed a contract in his own name, promising to pay the 2 million livres in a series of installments. He took possession of the magnificent, the heavy, and the dazzling necklace, and that night, in a state of high excitement and of triumphant anticipation, he handed the great jewel-encrusted box over to the Comtesse de la Motte, believing, with an absolute and an unshakable certainty, that she would deliver it discreetly to the queen that very night. Of course, the Comtesse did no such thing. Her husband, the self-styled Comte de la Motte, immediately took the great necklace to London, and there, with the help of the city's less scrupulous jewelers, it was broken up. The magnificent, the historic, and the easily identifiable great diamonds were removed from their settings and were sold off, one by one, in the murky and the untraceable black market of the London underworld. The great, the audacious, and the almost perfect crime was complete. The great and the inevitable scandal broke when the jewelers, Baumer and Bassange, having not received their first and very large installment payment from the cardinal, and growing increasingly desperate and suspicious, bypassed the cardinal and went directly to the Queen at Versailles to ask for their money. The Queen, of course, knew absolutely nothing about the necklace. She was baffled, she was confused, and then she was deeply and furiously angry. The king, Louis XVI, was informed. He was enraged, not just by the fraud, but by the shocking and the almost treasonous presumption of the Cardinal de Rohan in believing that the Queen of France would engage in such a sordid and a secret transaction. The cardinal was arrested, in a dramatic and a highly public fashion, in all his magnificent clerical finery, in the great hall of mirrors at Versailles, in front of the assembled, and the deeply shocked court. The Comtesse de la Motte was arrested. The sordid, the complex, and the almost unbelievable story came out in a sensational, and a highly public trial before the Parliament of Paris. The cardinal, in the end, was acquitted. The court decided that he was more of a fool than a knave, that his own foolishness and his vanity had made him the true victim of the affair. This verdict was, in itself, a great blow to the authority of the king, who had clearly wanted the cardinal to be found guilty. The Comtesse de la Motte, however, was found guilty. She was flogged. She was branded on the shoulder with a hot iron, with a V for velours, or thief, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment in the dreaded South prison, from which she later, and dramatically, escaped to London to write her scandalous, and largely fictitious, memoirs. But the real, the ultimate, and the tragic victim of the entire, sordid affair was the one person who had been completely and demonstrably innocent in the entire matter. The Queen, Marie Antoinette. Even though she had been cleared of any wrongdoing by the court, the scandal stuck to her with the tenacity of mud. For the common people of France, for the revolutionary pamphleteers, for a public that was already primed to believe the very worst of their foreign and supposedly decadent Austrian queen, the story of the diamond necklace was simply too good, too perfect, too symbolic, not to be true. It confirmed all of their deepest and their darkest prejudices. It was a perfect, a simple, and an unforgettable symbol of the decadence, the corruption, the almost unimaginable extravagance, and the utter, the complete, and the almost cartoonish moral bankruptcy of the royal court and of the entire Ancien. The story of the Queen and the diamonds, in 1,000 distorted, exaggerated, and often naked forms, became a powerful, a potent, and a deeply effective weapon in the hands of the revolutionary propagandists. It was one of the many small, and seemingly trivial, scandals that, when woven together, created the great, the overwhelming, and the unstoppable narrative of a monarchy that was no longer fit to rule. The fifth unspoken rule of royal life, a rule that was so tragically and so perfectly demonstrated in this affair, is that perception is reality. The objective truth of a matter is often far, far less important than the story that is told about it. The affair of the diamond necklace was, at its heart, a private, a sordid, and a criminal affair. It was a simple, if an unusually audacious, con game, played on a foolish, a vain, and an ambitious man, but it became a great applique and a profoundly political scandal, a scandal that would contribute, in its own small but significant way, to the growing, the unstoppable, and the all-consuming storm of popular anger that would, just a few short years later, sweep away the Queen, the King, and the entire, the ancient, and the glittering world of the French monarchy in a great, a terrible, and a world-changing revolution. The body of the king was not a private entity. It was not his own. In the complex, the powerful, and the deeply mystical political and spiritual theology of the medieval and the early modern world, the king was understood to have two bodies. He had his body, natural. This was the frail, the mortal, the vulnerable, and the all-too-human flesh and blood that was subject to sickness, to aging, to pain, and to the final, the inevitable, and the democratic indignity of death, just like any other man. But he also had his body politic. This was a second, a sacred, a mystical, and an immortal body that was the living, the breathing embodiment of the kingdom itself. This body politic was perfect, it was unchanging, it was, in a legal and a spiritual sense, divine. It could not get sick, it could not grow old, it could not die. The great legal scholar of the Tudor age, Edmund Plowden, famously articulated this principle. The king is dead, long live the king. The mortal, physical body of the individual king dies, but the immortal, the corporate body of the monarchy, the crown, passes, in a single, a seamless, and a mystical instant, to the air. But what happened when the king's body, natural, was not dead, but was broken in a different, a more terrifying, a more mysterious, and a more profoundly unsettling way? What happened when the king's mind, the very seat of his reason, of his judgment, of his royal will, of his connection to God, collapsed into the chaos, the darkness, and the terrifying abyss of madness? This was one of the most profound, the most dangerous, and the most constitutionally challenging crises that a dynastic monarchy could possibly face. A mad king was a living, breathing paradox. He was a sacred, an anointed vessel that was cracked and leaking. He was a body politic that was still, legally and physically, alive, but whose soul, whose reason, whose very capacity for rational thought had fled. The scandal of a mad king was a crisis that could paralyze a government, that could unleash the savage, the repressed ambitions of rival factions, and that could threaten to tear the delicate, and the unwritten fabric of the kingdom apart. Let us travel to the court of late 18th century England, a world that prided itself on its reason, on its stability, and on its balanced, constitutional monarchy. The king is George III. He is, for much of his long and eventful reign, a popular, a respected, and a deeply conscientious monarch. He is, in many ways, the very model of a modern, a constitutional king. He is a man of simple, of almost bourgeois tastes. He is a man of a deep, a sincere, and an almost puritanical piety. He is a man of a strong, an unbending, and a sometimes stubborn sense of duty. He is Farmer George, a monarch who is more interested in the new techniques of agriculture than in the decadent pleasures of the court. He is a devoted husband to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and the loving, if often stern and unforgiving, father of their 15 children. But in the summer of the year 1788, the 50-year-old king, a man who had until now been a model of physical health and of mental stability, began to exhibit a series of strange, of alarming, of deeply unsettling, and of increasingly public behaviors. It began, as these things so often do, with small and seemingly insignificant changes in his personality. He became more agitated, more talkative, more irritable. But then, his condition began to deteriorate with a frightening and an uncontrollable speed. He became manic. He would talk and talk and talk, for hours upon hours on end, his speech becoming faster, more pressured, more incoherent, until his voice was a raw and a painful hoarse whisper, and his mouth was filled with a sticky foam. He would write obsessive, frantic, and rambling letters, some of them thousands upon thousands of words long, the sentences disconnected, the thoughts leaping from one subject to another with a dizzying and a nonsensical velocity. He became physically agitated. He developed a kind of restless, an almost demonic, energy. He would pace, endlessly and relentlessly, back and forth in his chambers, wearing a path in the royal carpets. His servants, his pages, were unable to calm him, unable to restrain him. He suffered from a terrible and a debilitating insomnia, sometimes going for 3 or 4 days and nights without any sleep at all, his manic energy burning itself out, and he became delusional. His mind, which had once been so ordered and so rational, seemed to have lost its moorings to reality. He would claim to have spoken to angels. He would claim that London was flooded, and that he had seen it from his window at Windsor. He would mistake his loyal servants for long-dead historical figures, for his political enemies, for characters from Shakespeare's plays, and in the most shocking, the most public, and the most deeply humiliating moments, his behavior would descend into a kind of violent, a primal, and an almost animalistic madness. He would attack his own pages with a terrifying and an unpredictable fury. He would foam at the mouth. He would, in moments of extreme agitation, have to be physically overpowered by his attendants and tied to his bed with silken cords to prevent him from harming himself or others. The royal physicians were summoned to the king's side, but they were completely and utterly baffled. They were the most learned, the most respected, and the most expensive medical men in the kingdom, but they had no understanding of mental illness. The 18th century medical world had no concept of psychiatry, of neurology, of the complex and the delicate chemistry of the human brain. They saw the king's madness not as a disease of the mind, but as a disease of the body, a physical ailment whose symptoms just happened to be behavioral. And so, they subjected the poor, the suffering, the terrified king to a series of brutal, of ignorant, of deeply misguided, and of almost medieval treatments. all based on the ancient and the discredited theory of the four humors. They believed that the king's madness was caused by an excess of bad humors in his blood, and so they bled him repeatedly. They would open a vein in his arm and would drain a large quantity of his blood into a bowl. They purged him. They gave him powerful and debilitating emetics and laxatives, designed to violently and completely evacuate his body from both ends. They applied caustic and deeply painful, blistering poultices made from cantharides, the Spanish fly, to his skin, particularly to his legs and to his head, in the desperate and the superstitious hope of drawing the evil humors out of his body. And in the most desperate moments, when their own humoral theories had failed, they would resort to the brutal, the psychological, and the deeply authoritarian methods of the 18th century madhouse. The king was handed over to the care of a man named Dr. Francis Willis, a former clergyman who ran a private lunatic asylum. Dr. Willis's method was based on a simple, a brutal, and a terrifying principle: the breaking of the patient's will. He believed that the king's madness was a form of royal willfulness, an extreme and a rebellious loss of self-control, and that he could be terrified back into a state of sanity. And so, the King of England, the sacred and the anointed monarch, was subjected to a regime of almost unimaginable cruelty and of humiliation. He was restrained for hours on end in a specially designed strait waistcoat. He was chained to a chair. He was gagged. He was threatened. He was treated not as a sick man, but as a disobedient child, or as a wild and an untamed animal. These treatments were not just ineffective, they were a form of systematic and of medically sanctioned torture, and they only served to worsen the king's terror, his agitation, his confusion, and his profound and his deep human suffering. As the king's illness deepened, and as the brutal incompetence of his doctors became more apparent, the political life of the nation ground to a complete and a terrifying halt. The king was completely and totally unable to perform his essential constitutional duties. He could not sign documents. He could not meet with his ministers. He could not open parliament. The government of the entire British Empire was, in essence, paralyzed. And into this profound and this dangerous power vacuum, the savage, the bitter, and the long-simmering political rivalries of the court and of parliament exploded into a full-blown, vicious, and a deeply consequential political crisis. It was the Great Regency Crisis of 1788. On the one side of this crisis was the Prime Minister, the brilliant, the young, the austere, and the deeply competent William Pitt the younger, and his ruling Tory government. Their political power, their very existence as a government, was entirely and completely dependent on the personal favor and on the continued sanity of the king. If the king was to be declared to be permanently and incurably insane, they would be immediately dismissed from office. And so, they argued, with a great and a powerful conviction, for patience. They argued that the king's illness was a temporary, a physical one, and that he would, in time, recover his reason. On the other side of this crisis was the opposition Whig party, led by the charismatic, the brilliant, the dissolute, and the deeply ambitious Charles James Fox, and their great patron, their ally, and their future king, was the king's own estranged eldest son, the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV. The Prince of Wales was a flamboyant, an extravagant, a deeply indebted, a notoriously debauched, and a deeply and an almost pathologically irresponsible young man. He hated his stern, his moralistic, and his pious father with a profound and a bitter passion, and he could not wait to get his hands on the power, on the prestige, and most of all, on the immense money of the crown. He and his Whig allies argued, with an equal and an opposite conviction, that the king's madness was permanent, was incurable, was a total and an irreversible collapse of his intellect, and they argued that the Prince of Wales should be immediately and unconditionally declared regent, with the full and the untrammeled powers of the king. For months, from the autumn of 1788 to the spring of 1789, the two factions fought a bitter, a vicious, and a deeply and a personally abusive political battle in the Houses of Parliament and in the press. The most intimate, the most embarrassing, and the most deeply humiliating details of the king's madness were leaked, by both sides, to the newspapers and to the pamphlet writers. The sacred, the mystical, the private, and the supposedly untouchable body and mind of the king were being publicly and brutally dissected. His incoherent ramblings, his violent outbursts, the most intimate and the most pathetic details of his medical treatment were all being discussed, with a ghoulish and a partisan relish in the public sphere. The magic of monarchy, its carefully constructed aura of divine and of mysterious authority, was being torn away, revealing the frail, the pathetic, and the all-too-human reality of the suffering man beneath the crown. It was a profound, a deeply shocking, and a potentially revolutionary constitutional crisis. And then, in the spring of 1789, just as Parliament, after months of bitter debate, was about to pass a regency bill that would have given the Prince of Wales most, but not all, of the powers he craved, the king, as suddenly, as inexplicably, and as almost miraculously as he had fallen ill, began to recover. His mania subsided, his delusions faded, his reason returned. He was, once again, the sane, the calm, the rational, and the deeply dutiful monarch. The great regency crisis was over. Pitt and his government were saved. The Prince of Wales and his ambitious Whig allies were thwarted and were deeply, publicly humiliated. The nation celebrated the king's recovery with a great and a genuine outpouring of loyal and of heartfelt affection. But the king's recovery, tragically, was not a permanent one. The madness of King George would return, again and again, like a dark and a recurring tide. In the later years of his long reign, each new episode was more severe, was more prolonged than the last. In the year 1810, he descended into his final, his long, his deep, and his irreversible illness. This was a final, a lost decade of profound and of almost total darkness. He was blind, he was deaf, he was consumed by a deep and a gentle dementia. He would wander the corridors of Windsor Castle, a lonely, a pathetic figure with a long, white beard, playing his harpsichord and talking to the ghosts of his long-dead children. His son was finally, and without opposition, declared Prince Regent, and he would rule in his father's name for the last, long decade of the old king's life. The old, the blind, and the mad king finally died in the year 1820. What was the true, physical cause of the king's terrible and recurrent madness? For many centuries, the most widely accepted and orthodox diagnosis was porphyria, a rare, an inherited, and a complex blood disorder that can, in some of its forms, cause severe neurological and psychiatric symptoms, including mania, psychosis, and a dark reddish-purple urine that the historical records seem to describe. But more recently, many medical historians, re-examining the detailed and the copious records of the king's symptoms, have argued that the king's illness is far more consistent with a psychiatric diagnosis of bipolar disorder, a severe and a recurring psychiatric illness that is characterized by extreme and by cyclical mood swings, from deep, depressive episodes to periods of intense and often psychotic mania. The sixth unspoken rule of royal life, a rule that was so tragically and so publicly demonstrated in the long, sad life of King George III, is that the health of the king's mind is as important and is as fragile as the health of his body. The body politic and the body natural are, in the single, vulnerable person of the king, one and the same. And when the king's mind breaks, the very mind of the state itself is thrown into a state of profound, of dangerous, and of constitutional chaos. The scandal of a mad king is the ultimate, and the most terrifying, demonstration of the profound, and the almost unbearable, fragility of a system of government that is based entirely on the simple, and the random accident of a single man's birth, and on the delicate, the complex, and the ultimately unknowable sanity of a single human mind. The first, the most sacred, and the most solemn duty of any monarch, of any royal house, of any great and enduring dynasty, is to ensure the continuation of its own line, the production of a healthy, a legitimate, and in the deeply patriarchal world of European monarchy, ideally a male heir is the central, the primary, and the overwhelming obsession of any king. A secure, an unquestioned, and a clear line of succession is the greatest and most essential guarantee of a kingdom's stability. A disputed, an uncertain, or a failed succession is a direct and an open invitation to civil war, to chaos, to the collapse of the state. It is no surprise, then, that some of the greatest, the most consequential, and the most scandalous crises in all of royal history have revolved around the desperate, the frantic, and the often deeply and profoundly undignified race to produce a legitimate heir to the throne. Let us remain at the court of Britain, but let us move forward in time, into the early 19th century, into the period known as the Regency. The old, the blind, and the mad King George III is still, technically, alive, a silent and a tragic ghost, wandering the lonely corridors of Windsor Castle. But the country, and the vast British Empire, is ruled by his eldest son, the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, and the British monarchy, despite its recent and glorious victory over Napoleon, is facing a profound, a deep, and a deeply serious succession crisis. The problem, in a strange and an almost comical irony, was not a lack of royal children. The old king, George III, had been famously and impressively fertile. He had had 15 children with his wife, Queen Charlotte. The problem was a complete, an utter, and a truly astonishing lack of legitimate royal grandchildren. The future of the entire Hanoverian dynasty rested on a single, fragile, and ultimately tragic life. The Prince Regent himself, the man at the head of this great and sprawling family, was a walking, talking embodiment of the crisis. He had, in his youth, secretly, illegally, and in defiance of the Royal Marriages Act, married the love of his life, a beautiful, a witty, and a devoutly Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. Because she was a Catholic, this marriage was, in the eyes of the British Constitution, completely and totally invalid, and any children from this union would have been considered illegitimate, and would have been barred from the succession. The prince, deeply in debt, had later been forced by his father and by the government into an official, a public, and a disastrously unhappy marriage with a German princess, his own cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. It was a match that was doomed from the very start. The Prince Regent found his new wife to be coarse, to be vulgar, to be unhygienic. He is said to have spent their wedding night in a drunken stupor in the fireplace of the bridal chamber. But the marriage, for all its mutual loathing, had, in its first and only year of cohabitation, managed to fulfill its one and only dynastic purpose. It had produced one child, a daughter, the bright, the lively, and the immensely popular Princess Charlotte of Wales. And in the year 1817, the great hope of the nation, Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, had died, tragically and horribly, in childbirth, after a long and an agonizing 50-hour labor. Her own infant son was stillborn. Her death, at the age of only 21, was a national trauma, a moment of profound, of deep, and of almost universal grief, that was comparable only to the death of Princess Diana in our own time. The entire nation was plunged into mourning, and the royal succession was left in a state of complete, of utter, and of terrifying chaos. The Prince Regent was now in his mid-50s. He was estranged from his wife, Queen Caroline, whom he was actively and publicly trying to divorce in a scandalous and a deeply unpopular trial in the House of Lords, and he was morbidly and famously obese. He was highly and almost certainly unlikely to produce another legitimate heir, and his 12 surviving siblings, the 6 other sons and the 6 daughters of the old mad King George III, were a collection of the most eccentric, the most dissolute, and the most spectacularly and consistently, reproductively unsuccessful group of individuals in the entire long history of the British monarchy. The royal dukes, the king's younger brothers, were, for the most part, a collection of aging, of corpulent, of dissolute, and of deeply and permanently indebted libertines. They had spent their long, and their largely useless, lives in a state of idle and of irresponsible bachelorhood. They had lived openly and without shame, with a long and a colourful succession of mistresses, of actresses, of courtesans, and they had, between them, produced a vast, a sprawling, and a largely unacknowledged brood of illegitimate children, the Fitzclarences, the Fitzgeorges, the Dests, who were, by the strict and the unbending laws of the British Constitution, completely and utterly barred from the succession. There was the Duke of York, the second son, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. He was married, but he was estranged from his wife, and he was childless. He had been involved in a notorious public scandal a few years earlier, when his former mistress, Mary Ann Clark, had been found to be selling army commissions. There was the Duke of Clarence, the future King William IV, the third son. He had spent his youth in the Royal Navy, and for the past 20 years, he had been living in a state of comfortable and surprisingly happy domesticity with his long-term mistress, the famous and the beloved comic actress, Dorothea Jordan. He had had 10 healthy, and now grown, illegitimate children with her. There was the Duke of Kent, the fourth son, a stern, an autocratic, and a deeply unpopular soldier, a man known for his rigid and his often brutal discipline. He too had a long-term mistress of 27 years, a French-Canadian woman named Madame de Saint-Talent. There was the Duke of Cumberland, the fifth son, a reactionary, a hardline Tory, and the most deeply and universally despised man in the entire kingdom, a man who was rumoured to have murdered his own valet and to have had an incestuous affair with his own sister. He was married, but he was, as yet, childless. And there was the Duke of Sussex, a liberal and an eccentric man who had made 2 illegal marriages and whose children were, like the Prince Regent's, considered illegitimate. And finally, there was the Duke of Cambridge, the youngest son, who was still, at the age of 43, an unmarried bachelor. This was the state of the British royal family in the year 1817, a collection of aging, of eccentric, of childless, or of illegitimately childrened dukes. The future of the entire Hanoverian dynasty, the future of the British crown, was in a state of profound and of immediate peril, with the tragic death of Princess Charlotte, a great, a comical, a deeply unseemly, and a profoundly and a historically significant royal baby race began. The government and the nation suddenly and urgently put immense pressure on the king's aging and irresponsible brothers. They were, in essence, ordered to abandon their long-term mistresses, to cast off their illegitimate children, and to find suitable, to find royal, and, most importantly, to find fertile German Protestant princesses to marry. Their duty, to the nation and to the dynasty, was to get married, and to get married quickly, in the desperate and the almost farcical hope that one of them, in their late middle age, could produce a single, a healthy and a legitimate heir to the throne. And so, the great royal dukes, now all in their late 40s or their early 50s, were sent on a frantic and a deeply undignified search for suitable wives. It was a strange, a sudden, and a deeply cynical matrimonial scramble. The Duke of Clarence, the future King William IV, was forced, with a great deal of genuine and of heartfelt reluctance, to abandon his beloved mistress of 20 years, the actress Dorothea Jordan, the mother of his 10 children. He proposed to a series of wealthy English heiresses, who all turned him down. He finally, and dutifully, married the young, the kind, and the deeply pious Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a German princess who was half his age. The Duke of Kent, the stern and the unpopular soldier, also abandoned his long-term mistress of 27 years, Madame de Saint-Laurent, and he too found a German princess. He married the widowed Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the sister of Prince Leopold, the grieving widower of the deceased Princess Charlotte, and the Duke of Cambridge, the youngest brother, also dutifully and promptly married a German princess, the Princess Augusta of Hesse-Kassel. In a single year, 1818, there was a flurry of these strange and deeply unromantic royal weddings, and the entire nation, and indeed the royal courts of all of Europe, watched, with a mixture of amusement, of anxiety, and of a deep and a morbid fascination, to see which of these new and these hastily arranged royal marriages would be the first to cross the finish line, to produce a single, a healthy, and a legitimate child who could one day wear the crown of Great Britain. The first few attempts were tragic and dynastically worrying failures. The new, young Duchess of Clarence, Princess Adelaide, gave birth to 2 daughters, both of whom died in infancy. Her other pregnancies ended in miscarriages. The hopes of the nation began to fade. But then, in the spring of the year 1819, a breakthrough. The Duchess of Cambridge gave birth to a healthy son, Prince George of Cambridge, but he was the child of the youngest of the dukes. And then, just a couple of months later, the wife of the 4th, and the older, royal brother, the 50-year-old Duke of Kent, also gave birth. On the 24th of May, in the year 1819, his wife, the Duchess of Kent, gave birth to a healthy and a surprisingly robust baby girl at Kensington Palace in London. This baby girl was, at the time of her birth, only 5th in the line of succession to the throne. But as the long, and the slow, and the often improbable years passed, and as her old and her childless uncles, King George IV and King William IV, reigned and died, she would slowly, she would patiently, and she would inexorably move up the line of succession. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, and she would, in the year 1837, at the tender age of 18, be woken in the middle of the night at Kensington Palace to be told that her uncle, the old king, was dead, and that she was now the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The seventh unspoken rule of royal life, a rule that was so clearly and so almost comically demonstrated in this great and unseemly race, is that the womb of a princess is, in the final analysis, a matter of intense and of urgent national security. The personal lives, the loves, the happiness, the long-standing relationships of the members of the royal family are, in the end, secondary. They are, and they have always been, the property of the state. And in a moment of a profound and of a dangerous dynastic crisis, their bodies, their reproductive capacities, can be called into the direct, and the often ruthless, service of the nation, to produce an heir, to secure the succession, and to ensure the very survival of the crown. The great royal baby race of 1818 was a strange / a slightly ridiculous, a deeply cynical, and yet a profoundly and a deeply significant scandal that by a series of accidents, of chances, and of tragedies, would ultimately, and almost miraculously, produce one of the greatest, the most successful, and the most iconic monarchs in all of British history, Queen Victoria. As we move from the distant, the formal, and the often brutally straightforward scandals of the past into the bright, the loud, and the deeply complex world of the modern era, the very nature of royal scandal itself begins to change. The old, the foundational scandals of dynastic succession, of religious heresy, of high political treason, begin to fade into the background. They are replaced by a new, a more personal, a more intimate, and in many ways, a far more insidious and a more destructive kind of crisis. In the new and the all-powerful age of the mass media, of the television camera, of the tabloid newspaper, of the 24-hour news cycle, the greatest and the most dangerous scandals are no longer about the formal, the political power of the crown. They are about the private lives, the human frailties, the emotional struggles, and the psychological torments of the individuals who are forced, by the accident of their birth or of their marriage, to wear it. And no story, in the entire, long, and often tragic history of monarchy, illustrates this modern, and this deeply and profoundly tragic, form of royal scandal more powerfully, more poignantly, or more consequentially than the short, the brilliant, and the ultimately heartbreaking life and death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Let us travel to the Britain of the late 20th century. In the year 1981, the nation, and indeed the entire world, was captivated by what seemed to be a perfect, a timeless, and a beautiful fairy tale. The heir to the ancient British throne, the serious, the reserved, the intellectual, and the 32-year-old Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, was to marry a beautiful, a shy, a sweet-natured, and a 19-year-old aristocratic girl named Lady Diana Spencer. Their wedding, which took place in the magnificent, sun-drenched splendor of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, was a global media event on a scale that had never been seen before. It was a perfect and a dazzling spectacle of pomp, of pageantry, of tradition, and of what the world desperately wanted to believe was perfect, romantic love. It was hailed, without a hint of irony, as the wedding of the century. But the fairy tale, as we now know, with the sad and the often brutal clarity of hindsight, was a carefully, a deliberately, and a beautifully constructed illusion. The marriage, from its very, very beginning, was a deeply, a profoundly, and a tragically flawed one. It was, in a very real and a very sad sense, a return to the old, the pre-modern, and the often cruel model of the arranged, dynastic marriage. The prince, a complex, a sensitive, and an intellectual man, was still, and had always been, deeply and profoundly in love with another woman, a woman he had known and loved for many years, a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles. But Camilla was not, in the cold and the unforgiving eyes of the royal establishment of that time, considered to be a suitable bride for the future king. She was not a virgin, she was not an aristocrat of the very highest rank, and so, the prince, a man who was defined by his deep and his almost overwhelming sense of duty, had been told that he could not marry the woman he truly loved, but he was under immense and growing pressure from his family, from the government, and from the press, to find a suitable bride, and to do his dynastic duty, to produce an heir. And Diana, a young, an innocent, and a beautiful girl from a great aristocratic family, was, in a sense, chosen for the role. She was the perfect candidate on paper. She was young, she was beautiful, she was, crucially, a virgin, and she seemed to be a quiet, a gentle, an unbiddable girl who could be easily molded into the formal and the demanding role of a future queen. And the two of them, Charles and Diana, were profoundly, deeply, and tragically incompatible. He was a reserved, an intellectual, a sometimes distant, and a middle-aged man. A man who was burdened by his deep sense of duty, by his love for another woman, and by the immense and the often crushing weight of his own destiny. She was a young, an emotional, an intuitive, and a deeply and a painfully insecure girl, a child of a broken and an unhappy home, who was, in her own way, in love, not with the real, the complex, and the flawed man, but with the fairy tale, the romantic idea of the prince who had come to rescue her. And their union, this deeply and profoundly mismatched marriage, was conducted, from its very first day, under the relentless, the unforgiving, the intrusive, and the almost unbearable glare of the global media. The world had fallen in love with the image of the beautiful, young princess, and they demanded, to consume every single detail of her life. The marriage, which had begun with so much public hope and with so much private doubt, quickly and inevitably began to crumble behind the closed doors of the palace. The scandal that would eventually engulf them, and that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy, was not a dramatic event. It was a long, a slow, a painful, and a deeply and a publicly humiliating war of the Waleses. It was a war that was fought not on a traditional battlefield, but in the glossy, and often vicious, pages of the tabloid newspapers and on the flickering and ever-present television screens of the world. Diana, feeling isolated, feeling unloved, feeling misunderstood, and feeling trapped within the rigid, the formal, and the often cold and unfeeling institution of the royal family, the firm as it was known, began to struggle with profound, and with deeply serious, emotional and psychological problems. She suffered from a deep, a debilitating, and a recurring depression, and she developed a serious and a eating disorder, bulimia nervosa, a secret and a shameful cycle of binging and of purging that was a desperate and a physical manifestation of her deep and her almost unbearable emotional pain. And in a revolutionary, a brilliant and a deeply shocking act for a member of the traditionally silent and stoic royal family, she began to use the media, the very institution that was so relentlessly tormenting her, as her own powerful weapon. She began, in secret, to collaborate with a journalist, a man named Andrew Morton, on a biography that would, for the very first time, tell her own, true side of the story. When the book, Diana, Her True Story, was published in the year 1992, it was a bombshell. It was a literary explosion that sent shockwaves through the entire British establishment. It revealed, in the princess's own, raw, and often desperate words, the hidden secrets of her desperately unhappy marriage. It revealed the truth of her husband's ongoing and deeply loving affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. It revealed the truth of her own lonely suicide attempts. It revealed the truth of her secret and her long-running battle with bulimia. It completely and irrevocably shattered the carefully constructed and now deeply phony fairy tale image forever. It was an act of unprecedented and of almost unimaginable bold defiance against the royal family's most sacred and most ancient code of conduct, the code of silence, of calmness and composure, of never complain, never explain. The war, now out in the open, escalated with a terrible and a brutal speed. A series of intimate and deeply embarrassing telephone conversations, both of the prince and of the princess, were secretly recorded and were leaked to the press. The Camilla Gate tapes, as they were called, revealed an intimate and a deeply cringeworthy late-night conversation between Prince Charles and his mistress, Camilla. The Squidgegate tapes revealed a similarly intimate conversation between Diana and a male friend, a man named James Gilby. The private lives, the most intimate and the most secret thoughts of the future king and queen, were now public property, a source of global gossip, of ridicule, and of a deep and a profound national embarrassment. The prince, in a desperate and a deeply misguided attempt at public relations damage control, agreed to a televised interview, and in that interview, he publicly, and with a great and a painful awkwardness, admitted his adultery. And then, in the year 1995, Diana, not to be outdone, gave her own, now legendary, and truly bombshell, televised interview to the BBC programme, Panorama. In that interview, speaking in a quiet, a conspiratorial, and a deeply effective voice. Her large, sad eyes mascara-rimmed, and looking directly into the camera, she spoke with a raw, a compelling, and an almost devastating honesty about her unhappiness, about her loneliness, about the lack of support she had received from the royal family, and about her husband's long-running affair. And she delivered the single, the most famous, and the most devastating line of the entire, long, and sorry saga. When asked if she thought Mrs. Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of her marriage, she replied, with a masterful and a deeply poignant turn of phrase, "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. This was a new, a revolutionary, and a deeply modern kind of royal scandal. It was a scandal that was not about politics, or about religion, or about the succession. It was a scandal about love, about betrayal, about mental health, about profound and deeply relatable human suffering. And in this great and public and deeply modern battle for the sympathy of the people, Diana won. She won, overwhelmingly. She had, with a brilliant and intuitive and a deeply modern genius for public relations, recast herself. She was no longer just a princess, a beautiful but a silent and a ceremonial figure. She was the people's princess. She was the victim of a cold, an unfeeling, and an outdated institution. She was a symbol of a new, a more modern, a more open, and a more emotionally honest way of being. She had, in essence, created a new, a rival, and a far more popular court, a court of public opinion, a court of the heart, the Queen, the long-reigning and the deeply traditional Elizabeth II. In a desperate attempt to end the public and the deeply damaging war, finally and formally ordered the couple to divorce, which they did in the year 1996. Diana was, in the divorce settlement, stripped of her prestigious and important title of Her Royal Highness, but she retained her title of Princess of Wales, and she retained her immense, her almost magical, and her global popularity. But her story, this great, modern, and almost mythic fairy tale that had gone so terribly and so publicly wrong, was to have a final, a shocking, and a deeply, deeply tragic chapter. On the 31st of August, in the year 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a Highspeed and a horrific car crash in a tunnel in the city of Paris. She was killed alongside her new lover, the Egyptian millionaire, Dodi Fayed. The car in which they were traveling, which was being driven by a drunk driver, was, at the time of the crash, being relentlessly and aggressively pursued by a group of paparazzi, the freelance and often ruthless photographers who had hounded her, who had stalked her, and who had profited from her image for the past, long and difficult decade. Her death was met with an unprecedented, a spontaneous, and a truly astonishing global outpouring of grief, of anger, and of hysteria. The great scandal of her life was transformed, in the instant of her death, into the great and the profound tragedy of her death. The public, the people who had so eagerly and so voraciously consumed the endless stories of her unhappiness, now turned their collective grief and their collective anger on the 2 institutions that they place in their hearts, blamed for her death: the intrusive, the parasitic, and the rapacious media, and the cold, the formal, and the seemingly unfeeling royal family, who were seen as having failed to protect her, as having cast her out into the wilderness to be devoured by the wolves of the press. The 8th unspoken rule of modern royalty, a rule that was so tragically and so brutally written in the life and the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, is that the media is a ravenous, a powerful, and a deeply and a dangerously ambiguous beast. It can make you into a global icon, a queen of hearts, a saint, but it can also, in its relentless, its insatiable, and its often cruel pursuit of a story, of a picture, of a scandal, destroy you. The life and the death of Diana was the ultimate, the quintessential modern royal scandal. It was a story that revealed the profound, the painful, and the often brutal incompatibility of a deeply private, a deeply complex, and a deeply human emotional life with the intense, the unforgiving, and the all-consuming demands of a public and a royal existence in the modern and the media-saturated age. There is a fundamental, a deep, an ancient, and an almost sacred conflict that lies at the very heart of the institution of hereditary monarchy. It is the profound and the often irreconcilable conflict between the private, the human, and the emotional desires of the individual who happens, by the sheer and the random accident of their birth, to be the king, and the immense, the public, the symbolic, and the inescapable duties of the crown that he has inherited. Throughout the long and the often bloody history of monarchy, this fundamental and existential conflict has been the source of countless scandals, of wars, of tragedies, of rebellions. But rarely, if ever, in the entire long history of the British Crown, has this conflict been so starkly, so publicly, and so consequentially played out, as it was in the great, the dramatic, the deeply romantic, and the profoundly destabilizing abdication crisis of the year 1936. This was a scandal that, for the first time, in the full, the bright, and the unforgiving glare of the modern world's attention, forced a king to choose. It was a choice between his deep, his passionate, and his all-consuming love for a woman, and his sacred, his ancient, and his solemn duty to his throne, to his people, and to his God. Let us travel to the Britain of the 1930s. It is a nation that is still, in many ways, reeling from the profound, the almost unimaginable trauma of the First World War. It is a nation that is struggling with the economic devastation of the Great Depression, with mass unemployment, with poverty, with a deep and a pervasive sense of national anxiety. And it is a nation that is watching, with a growing and a profound sense of dread, the rise of the new, the aggressive, and the terrifying ideologies of fascism and of communism in Europe. Hitler is in power in Germany. Mussolini is in power in Italy. Stalin is in power in the Soviet Union. The storm clouds of another great, and perhaps an even more terrible, war are gathering on the horizon. In this time of deep, of profound, and of widespread anxiety and of fear, the British monarchy is seen, by many, as a vital, a precious, and an almost sacred symbol of stability, of continuity, of tradition, and of national unity. It is the one, fixed, an unchanging point in a rapidly and a terrifyingly changing world. In January of the year 1936, the old king, George V, died. He had been a stern, a dutiful, a deeply conservative, and a widely respected monarch, a father figure to his people. His eldest son, the popular, the charming, the handsome, and the deeply modern Prince of Wales, ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII. He was, at first, seen as a breath of fresh and of much-needed air. He was 41 years old. He was handsome. He was charismatic. He was famously and stylishly dressed. And he was, most excitingly of all, a bachelor. He seemed to represent a new, a more modern, a more glamorous, and a more informal style of monarchy. A style that was perfectly suited to the new, the fast-moving, and the media-savvy age of the 20th century. But behind the scenes, behind the carefully constructed public image of the charming and the carefree bachelor prince, the new king was harboring a secret that would, in the space of a few short months, plunge the nation, the empire, and the monarchy itself into a profound and a deeply dangerous constitutional crisis. For several years, he had been engaged in a passionate, a deep, and an all-consuming love affair with an American woman named Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was, in the cold, the judgmental, and the deeply unforgiving eyes of the British establishment of the 1930s, a completely and utterly and a catastrophically unsuitable partner for a future king. She was not an aristocrat by birth. She was a commoner from Baltimore. She was an American, at a time when the British upper classes often looked down on Americans as being brash, as being vulgar, as being uncultured, and most damningly, most insurmountably of all, she had already, in her past, divorced her first husband, a US Navy pilot, and at the time her affair with the king began, she was still married to her second husband, a quiet, a dignified, and a long-suffering Anglo-American shipping executive named Ernest Simpson. For the King of England, who was also, by the ancient and the unbending laws of the land, the supreme governor of the Church of England, the established National Protestant Church, an institution that at that time did not recognize divorce, and that considered the remarriage of a divorced person whose first spouse was still alive to be a profound and an unforgivable sin. For this king to marry a twice-divorced woman, a woman whose two previous husbands were still very much alive, was a constitutional, a religious, and a political impossibility. It was a direct and a public challenge to the very moral and spiritual foundations of his own authority. But King Edward VIII was a man who was, in his own charming and deeply self-centered way, a rebel. He was a man who had always chafed under the strict, the formal, and the often suffocating constraints of his royal role. He was a man who was used to getting his own way. He was stubborn, he was willful, and he was deeply, profoundly, and obsessively in love. He was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, and he was, in his almost breathtaking naivety, determined to make her his queen. As soon as he ascended to the throne, in the very first weeks of his reign, he informed the Prime Minister, a solid, a respectable, and a deeply conservative man named Stanley Baldwin, of his intention. The government, the Church of England, and the senior members of the royal family were thrown into a state of absolute, of profound, and of almost hysterical horror. They saw Wallis Simpson not just as an unsuitable and an embarrassing wife for the king. They saw her, with a deep and a genuine, if a deeply prejudiced, conviction, as a dangerous, a morally corrupting, and a politically suspect influence on the new king. She was seen as an adventuress, as a gold digger, as a woman of a loose and a questionable moral character. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, after consulting with his cabinet and with the leaders of the great dominions of the British Empire, Canada, Australia, South Africa, made the position of the government absolutely and unequivocally clear to the king. He told the king, with a quiet, a firm, and an unbending gravity, that the government, and the people of Britain and of the Empire, would never, under any circumstances, accept Mrs. Simpson as their queen. He told the king that if he insisted on the marriage, the government would have no other choice but to resign, an act that would trigger a massive and a potentially revolutionary political crisis. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the spiritual head of the Church of England, made it equally clear that the Church would never, under any circumstances, sanction the marriage. The king was presented with a stark, a simple, and an absolutely unavoidable choice. He could give up the woman he loved, the woman he believed was his one true soulmate, and he could continue as king, living a lonely, a loveless, and a dutiful life of public service. Or he could have the woman he loved, but he would have to give up the throne. He would have to give up his birthright, his kingdom, his empire. He could not have both. For many long and agonizing months, from the summer to the winter of 1936, a tense, a dramatic, and a deeply secret battle of wills was fought behind the closed and the silent doors of Buckingham Palace and of 10 Downing Street. The king, stubborn and romantic, refused to believe that his people would not, in the end, accept the woman he loved. He even toyed with the idea of a morganatic marriage, a marriage where Wallis would be his wife but would not be the queen, a solution that was common in the royal houses of Germany, but that had no precedent in British law. The government, equally stubborn and deeply conscious of its constitutional duty, refused to budge. The British press, in a remarkable, final, and a now almost unimaginable act of collective self-censorship, and of deep and of patriotic deference to the crown, agreed to a gentleman's agreement not to report on the looming crisis, and so, the British public, for most of that long and difficult year, was kept completely and totally in the dark about the great and the momentous drama that was unfolding at the very heart of the state. But the American and the European press had no such scruples. Their newspapers, particularly the sensationalist tabloids of New York, were filled, week after week, with lurid, with detailed, and with often highly inaccurate stories of the new King of England and his scandalous, his twice divorced, and his shockingly common American lover. Finally, in the early days of December, the dam of silence in Britain broke. The story of the king's love affair and of the constitutional crisis it had provoked was finally and explosively reported in the British press. The nation was thrown into a state of shock, of disbelief, and of intense and of deeply divided emotion. For a few brief and heady days, it seemed that the king might have a chance to win. He was, after all, a deeply popular and a charismatic figure, and the story of a king willing to give up his throne for the woman he loved was a deeply and a powerfully romantic one. There were popular demonstrations in his favor in the streets of London. The great populist press barons, like Lord Beaverbrook, and even the maverick and the brilliant politician Winston Churchill, rallied to his cause. But the establishment, the great, the silent, and the immensely powerful forces of the government, of the church, of the aristocracy, of the civil service, held firm. They would not have this woman as their queen. The choice remained, the throne or Mrs. Simpson, and the king, in the end, made his decision. He chose love. He chose the woman over the crown. On the 10th of December, in the year 1936, King Edward VIII, who had reigned for only 326 days, one of the shortest reigns in all of British history, sat down at a desk at his private home, Fort Belvedere. and he signed the formal, the legal, and the irrevocable instrument of abdication. His younger, his shy, his quiet, his deeply reluctant, and his completely unprepared brother, the Duke of York, the man who had a terrible and a lifelong stammer, and who had never, for a single moment, expected or wanted to be king, was thrust, against all his instincts and all his desires, onto the throne. He became King George VI. The next night, the former king, now known once again simply as Prince Edward, made a famous, a beautiful, and a deeply and a profoundly moving farewell address to the nation and to the empire. It was broadcast on the new and the powerful medium of the radio. He spoke, in his famous, his clear, and his deeply and almost heartbreakingly aristocratic voice, from a room in Windsor Castle. He said, "At long last I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor, and now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart." And then he came to the heart of the matter. "You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne, but I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire which, as Prince of Wales, and lately as king, I have for 25 years tried to serve. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." He went into a self-imposed and a lifelong exile. He married Wallis Simpson in a quiet and a lonely ceremony in France. He was given the new title of the Duke of Windsor by his brother, the new king, and they lived out the rest of their long, and their often empty, and their deeply sad lives as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. They were glamorous, they were fashionable, they were endlessly fascinating to the press, but they were, in the end, politically and historically irrelevant figures. They were ghosts, wandering the high society of Europe and of America, forever and inextricably defined by the great, the romantic, and the tragic scandal, by the great and the impossible sacrifice that had been at the very, very center of their lives. The ninth unspoken rule of royalty, a rule that was so clearly, so painfully, and so publicly demonstrated in this great crisis, is that the crown is a heavier, is a colder, and is a more demanding burden than any one individual. The king is not a private person. The king is not free to love whom he chooses. The king is an institution. He is a symbol. He is the living embodiment of the nation, and his personal, his human, and his deeply felt desires, his simple, human need for love and for happiness, must always, and without exception, be sacrificed for the greater good, for the stability, for the continuity of that great, that impersonal, and that unforgiving institution. The abdication crisis was a profound, and a deeply, and a lastingly romantic tragedy. It was the story of a king who, in the final analysis, chose to be a man, and in doing so, he reaffirmed the ancient, the harsh, the unforgiving, and the almost inhuman logic of the monarchy itself. And so, our long, our quiet, and our contemplative night's journey through the secret, the scandalous, and the often deeply and profoundly tragic world of royalty comes to its end. We have traveled, in the theater of our own minds, through the long and the often bloody centuries. We have stood in the glittering, the decadent, and the politically charged court of 18th century France, a world of absolute power and of the institutionalized royal mistress. We have stood in the terrifying, the paranoid, and the deeply religious court of Tudor England, a world where a queen's fertility was a matter of state, and her failure a matter of treason. We have stood in the anxious, the gossip-fueled, and the deeply sectarian court of Stuart England, a world where the very legitimacy of a newborn prince could be questioned and a dynasty overthrown by a well-told and a vicious rumor. We have stood in the agonizing, the private, and the deeply misunderstood world of a mad king, a world where a personal, a medical crisis became a profound and a dangerous constitutional one. We have witnessed the almost farcical, and yet deeply and historically significant, royal baby race that secured the future of the British crown. We have lived through the great, the romantic, and the world-shattering abdication crisis, a moment when the personal desires of a king clashed, fatally, with the ancient and the unbending duties of his office. And we have explored the tragic, the modern, and the media-saturated life and death of the people's princess, a story that redefined the very nature of royal celebrity and of royal scandal. And in this long and in this winding journey, we have seen the very nature of royalty and of royal scandal itself change in a profound, a deep, and a fundamental way. The old scandals of the pre-modern world, of Henry VIII, of Marie Antoinette, were, at their very heart, scandals of power. They were about the great, the foundational, and the structural pillars of the state. They were about the legitimacy of the royal succession. They were about the integrity of the royal bloodline. They were about the sacred and the often contested relationship between the crown and the church, the private lives of the monarchs. Their adulteries, their passions, their hatreds, were scandalous only insofar as they had a direct, a tangible, and a often catastrophic impact on the public, the political, and the dynastic life of the nation. The scandals of the modern world, the world of the 20th and the 21st centuries, the world of Diana, Princess of Wales, of the abdication crisis, and of the endless, the smaller, and the often more trivial and more personal crises that have beset the royal families of Europe in our own time, are of a fundamentally different and a new nature. They are, for the most part, scandals of personality. They are scandals of private behavior, of emotional frailty, of psychological distress, of human and of ultra-human imperfection. The focus of the public's interest has shifted, decisively and irrevocably. It has shifted from the great, the impersonal, the mystical, and the sacred body politic of the king, to the small, the vulnerable, the flawed, and the deeply human body natural of the individual prince or princess. This profound and this world-altering shift has been driven by two great, by two interconnected, and by two irresistible historical forces. The first is the long, the slow, the gradual, and the inexorable decline in the real, the tangible, and the political power of the monarchy itself. In the great, democratic age that was born out of the revolutions of the 18th and the 19th centuries, the monarch no longer truly rules. They reign, they are a symbol, they are a figurehead, they are a focus of national identity, of tradition, of continuity. They no longer have the real, the direct power to make laws, to command armies, to break with the church, to impose their will upon the nation. And as their real, their political power has declined, the public's interest in their political function has also, naturally, declined. The complex and the often arcane details of constitutional monarchy are, for most people, a dry and an academic subject. But the human heart, the human drama, is a subject of eternal and of universal interest. And into this vacuum of political relevance, of real power, has rushed the second great and defining force of the modern age. The rise of the mass media, the invention of the photograph in the 19th century, of the popular, mass circulation tabloid newspaper, of the radio, of the television, of the 24-hour news cycle, and finally, of the internet and of social media, has created a new, a powerful, and an insatiably, almost terrifyingly hungry beast. And this beast feeds on personality. It feeds on celebrity. It feeds on human drama. It feeds, above all else, on scandal. The modern royal family, in this new and this unforgiving media ecosystem, has become, whether they like it or not, the ultimate celebrity family. Their lives are the ultimate, the longest running, and the most compelling reality show. Every single aspect of their existence, from a great estate and a televised wedding, to a messy, a public, and a bitter divorce, from the birth of a royal baby, to a clumsy, an off-the-cuff, and an ill-advised remark at a public engagement, is subject to a level of intense, of relentless, of microscopic, and of often deeply and profoundly unforgiving public scrutiny that would have been utterly and completely unimaginable to a great, an absolute, and a truly private monarch like Louis XV or George III. This has created a profound, a deep, and an almost impossible paradox at the very heart of the modern constitutional monarchy. On the one hand, to survive, to remain relevant, to justify its own continued and privileged existence in a skeptical and a democratic age, the monarchy must be seen. It must engage with the media. It must present a human, a relatable, a friendly, and an accessible face to the public. It must be a family, a model family, the nation's family. But on the other hand, the very act of revealing its humanity, the very act of showing its flaws, of admitting to its imperfections, of engaging with the relentless and the often trivial demands of the media, undermines the very thing that, in the past, made it royal in the first place. It undermines its mystique. It undermines its aura of being different, of being set apart, of being, in some small, a residual, and a deeply important way, sacred. The great, and often tragic, scandals of the modern royal era are the product of this impossible, this unavoidable, and this deeply stressful tension. They are the moments when the carefully, the professionally, and the almost desperately constructed public mask of royal perfection slips, and the messy, the complicated, the unhappy, and the all-too-human reality of the individuals behind the mask is revealed to a public that is, at once, both deeply sympathetic and deeply almost gleefully judgmental. And our own reaction to these scandals, as the public, as the audience, has also changed in a fundamental way. We are no longer the deferential, the respectful, the largely uninformed, and the politically powerless subjects of the past. We are the audience, we are the consumers, we are, in a very real sense, the judges. We consume the stories of their lives with a voracious, a constant, and an often deeply and profoundly hypocritical appetite. We celebrate their beautiful, their fairy tale weddings, and we devour, with an almost equal relish, the lurid, the sordid, and the deeply painful details of their inevitable divorces. We demand that they be perfect, that they be flawless, that they be dignified and unchanging symbols of the nation, and at the very same time, we demand that they be just like us. We demand that they be real, that they be human, that they be flawed, that they be relatable. The final and the most important unspoken rule of modern royalty is that the old, the ancient, and the unwritten contract that once existed between the monarch and the people has been broken, has been shattered. The old relationship, a relationship that was based on a complex and a powerful mixture of divine right, of religious awe, of military power, and of a deep, an almost instinctual, and an unthinking deference, is gone, and it is gone forever. It has been replaced by a new, an unwritten, and a deeply and a profoundly unstable contract. It is a contract that is based not on power, but on popularity. It is a contract that is based not on divine right, but on public relations. It is a contract that is based not on the will of God, but on the fickle, the ever-changing, and the often ruthless and unforgiving judgment of the great, and the new, and the all-powerful court of public opinion. And so, we leave this world of secrets, of scandals, of tragedies, and of triumphs. We leave the ghosts of the queens, of the kings, of the mistresses, of the pretenders, of the madmen, and of the princesses, to their quiet, and their often unquiet, place in the complex, the beautiful, and the often deeply sorrowful story of royalty. The institution of monarchy, in our modern, our democratic, and our deeply and profoundly cynical age, may seem like a strange, an anachronistic, and an almost irrational survivor from a bygone and a long-dead world. But its power to fascinate, its power to scandalize, and its unique and its enduring power to hold up a mirror to our own ever-changing ideas about power, about family, about love, about duty, and about the often impossible and tragic conflict between the private self and the public role, remains as potent, as compelling, and as enduring as ever. The candles have finally and completely gone out. The great, the silent, and the shuttered palace is now dark. The long, and the often scandalous, and the deeply human night of history is over. Sleep well.